Hello and welcome to Headlines. Government efficiency, by and large, everywhere means the self-same. The fulfillment of essential government tasks in the most economical, cost-effective way in terms of resources and time. Elon Musk, head of the Department of Government Efficiency, who believes that there is a great deal of inefficiency about the federal government, its agencies and institutions, with the US Agency for International Development, USAID, being the very acme of incompetence, corruption and waste, has recently called for the shutdown of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty and Voice of America, two famous, critics would say infamous, media outlets funded by US taxpayers' money. Sweeping changes are already in motion in the United States, with radical efforts being intensified on a daily basis by the supremely powerful department, which is technically not a department but an advisory group, led by the efficiency prophet. Yet what is also probable is that it will not be an easy ride for Elon Musk. The fact that a federal judge has temporarily blocked the department's access to critical treasury payment system could perhaps be deemed as a harbinger of a future government-judiciary battle, with fateful, bad or good consequences to follow. Joining me now to discuss this very interesting subject is Joana Ricardo, historian, political scientist and integrated researcher at the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, Coimbra University, Portugal. Welcome to Headlines.
Thank you.
Well, let's get the basics right. Government efficiency and government effectiveness are two different notions. How do those notions apply to USAID and other soft tool mechanisms employed by the United States?
Well, it obviously depends on how the government of the United States is redefining the very notion of efficacy and the very types of multilateral engagements that the United States aims to have in the future. So at this point, what we have is clearly a very impactful change in the way that the administration of the United States is seeing the role of the country in international, borders. So at this moment, what we are seeing is Donald Trump trying to remove the United States from the very institutions, from the very norms and organizations that were developed ever since the Second World War, in which the United States have actually have a very important role in terms of how the definition was made of the rules and the way that these institutions would act. So, for example, when we look into the United Nations, the United States is one of the biggest donors, actually the biggest donor of the United Nations, but this is no charity. This is obviously the way that the United States has been spreading its will and its power all over the world, especially after the end of the Soviet Union in the 90s, in which the United States have been the most important hegemonic power in the world. So what we have at this point is clearly a change, a shift in this, which Donald Trump says that it marks the beginning of a new era for the ascension of the United States. And it seems clear to me that it's the opposite way around. It's marking the decline of the United States, the decline of the United States influence all over the world, the decline of the United States presence all over the world. And especially when you mention USAID, this is one of the key tools of soft power of the United States, in which the United States supports several countries and makes it present in those countries. So it spreads its influence. So we're talking clearly about a post-liberal area that is forming and transforming in front of our eyes.
I mean, how would you evaluate the government efficiency when it comes to USAID? Because from what Elon Musk said, it is very clear the construct here is based on the idea of actually comparing the resources employed and the results achieved. When you look at those soft power tools, including USAID, do you think they have served the United States well over the past decades?
Well, it seems very clear to me that they have. So on the one hand, as you said, the notion of efficiency is a very economic notion. So we're talking about the way funds are spent and if they are giving us back in a sense. So when we're talking about efficiency, what is important is primarily the financial role. But the very notion of why these tools were created, they if we need to understand this, we need to look back into history to understand how the United States has actually created this whole apparatus of power that is based on these institutions, these norms, these organizations that were developed in the sense that the United States can influence other parts of the world. And especially when we're talking about a globalized world, which is what we have ever since the 70s, and especially getting deeper after the 90s, and mainly because of the mobility of people, the mobility of goods and services. It's very important that, for example, trying to eradicate sickness and certain diseases in some parts of the world is actually a way to protect ourselves. This was very much clear during the pandemic because we understood how these viruses literally travel all over the country. So eradicating those sickness is also a way to protect our own borders. So when the United States talks about protecting the borders of the country, this is also a way to do so. I also think that those tools, they have been very much efficient in maintaining the United States influence all over some countries, which is something that is also in decline, especially in countries in Africa, for example, in which China is kind of clearly trying to take over, especially with a lot of investment in infrastructure for energy and development and those kinds of programs that the United States was actually the hegemonic power in doing so.
Yeah. But clearly, from what you said, it's very clear that you regard the new approach maintained by the United States as signifying its decline. It's sort of retrenching. Its influence around the world is being sort of curbed. But what do you make of that internal debate, which is currently going on in the United States, about USAID and other organizations being the acme of corruption, nepotism, ineptitude, and fundamental failure in terms of the efficiency of the usage of those resources? Do you think that they have deserved something to earn that criticism by the government which is in charge now?
Well, I'd say that this is mainly the discourse that we've been hearing, and it's not only in the United States. For example, we can see this when we're talking about the United Nations agencies. For example, Israel has targeted for a very long time UNRWA, which is the United Nations Agency for Refugees that was created ever since 1948 to help and deal with the Palestinian refugees. And these accusations of corruption, of mismanagement of resources, they are part of this discourse that has been constructed throughout this whole administration, which is for me clearly a very important and relevant change in the way that the United States is thinking about its role in the world, because in the end of the day, it depends on how you are defining efficiency, right? So the United States pays for certain things, but then it gets back in influence, it gets back in soft power, it gets back in alliances, and these kind of things, they're clearly on the line right now.
And of course, there will be some implications, international implications of these measures taken inside the United States. Elon Musk earlier said that USAID is a criminal organization, a time for it to die, extreme statement. And those people who happen to be supporters of USAID, they're saying that government is currently taking over in a mafia-style way. So it looks like the massive confrontation going on in the United States, and there will be probably implications in terms of government-judiciary battle at a later stage. What is your general perception, general analysis of what Trump would call revolution of common sense and its internal implications between battles to different camps?
But this is probably one of the key features of why Donald Trump was elected, right? So we have here this question of what is referred in the United States as the wokeism. So it means how the liberal left have dealt with questions of human rights, of inclusion, of difference, and these kinds of politics, they're trying to move the United States back, actually, several decades, to be honest, with this so-called revolution of common sense, which is considering that, people have only two genders, which are the ones that they were born with. The idea of criminalizing abortion, for example, everything that is connected to this is very much a huge change on the very frameworks of human rights, which the United States was one of the key players to the development. So in the end of the day, what appears to me is that what Donald Trump is trying to do is to bring back the United States to a very traditional type of conservator type of politics. And this is going to backlash, obviously, because what we have in terms of the politics of the United States is a country which is very diverse. It is a country that is made of immigration. It is a country that's got several different types of people contributing to its development. For example, when he talks about sending back immigrants, this is a politics that is going to create a lot of economic impact because, for example, many of the migrants that are being now deported, they are working in specific sectors such as the construction sector that is key to deal with the crisis of housing. So in the end of the day, what Donald Trump is doing is going to impact all of his economic policies and also to isolate the United States. So it seems to me that there is no common sense in here. And obviously, this is obviously easy to see when the president of the United States talks about buying territory that is not on sale or trying to oblige countries to sell the territory. I'm talking specifically about Greenland, or when he considers Canada the 51st state, or even the changes of names such as the Gulf of Mexico that is now the Gulf of America. So these kind of things, they are no common sense in any way, and they're going to bring the United States back in terms of relationships, because by all means, what Donald Trump is doing is targeting his allies. And this is going to have huge consequences in the way that the United States relates with with other countries and is positioned in the international system.
A more specific question. US Special Envoy for Special Missions earlier criticized the Radio Free Liberty and Radio Europe and also Voice of America as taxpayer-funded media filled with far-left activists, describing these outlets as a relic of the past. And Elon Musk responded to saying that indeed they are very ideologically driven and it's a waste of money. Do you think in the current juncture, bearing in mind the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago, those institutions, Voice of America and Radio Free Europe Liberty, are indeed relics of the past? And why on earth for Donald Trump, for somebody who is probably very much interested about extending American influence around the world, but by different means perhaps, those symbols, which many people would regard as symbols of American presence outside the world, are so easily expendable?
Well, actually, those two media outlets, those two radios, they are still very much relevant in terms of the amount of people they reach, which is around 280 million people worldwide. They still broadcast in more than 40 languages. So they remain actually a relevant tool of soft power, specifically in former Soviet republics. And they were built precisely with this intention. Obviously, they are some sort of anachronic institutions, such as the United Nations is, and even NATO until the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was a very obsolete institution. But those institutions, they are living institutions, so they keep reforming themselves through time. And actually, those two radios, the Voice of America and the Radio Free Europe, they were actually built in a very specific context, which is during the Second World War, in the case of the Voice of America in 1942 and in the case of Radio Free Europe in 1950s, both with the very intention of counteracting first Nazi propaganda and then Soviet propaganda. And in the end of the day, this is still something that they do. For example, the Radio Free Europe is still very relevant in the case of the war with Ukraine. They reach Russian audiences, and you know that Russia is still an autocrat state, so media is very much controlled. Those media, they have the ability to speak to these audiences and to bring some freedom of press. And it's interesting to see Elon Musk saying that we need to have full freedom of press, and this is actually what he's been saying for a long time. And when he purchased Twitter, the former Twitter, the current X, this was precisely the idea that freedom of speech had to be preserved by all means. And then now his argument is precisely the one that there is far left people speaking to each other in those radios. So you see that there is here double standards that is always used in those kinds of discourses. But the main thing here for me is not necessarily what is the specific still influence of those two tools, but mainly how this is a constant threat to democracy, to the freedom of speech, to institutions, and especially how the main plan in this Department of Government Efficiency is to dismantle the state, which is going to have a lot of impact in the United States, obviously, because we're talking about a very stabilized democracy, which is clearly under threat right now, and very much looking like some autocratic governments all over the world, which is interesting because in the end of the day, they say precisely that what they want is to counteract this, but the measures that we've been seeing, they're actually very contentious, and this is why you mentioned the legal battles that are rising and are probably going to keep existing in the near future and during all of the mandate of Donald Trump.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, the executive orders, their legality, their draconian nature have been discussed in the United States of America. Trump supporters would say that they are perfectly legal, executive orders, president vested with those duties. Those critics would say that they're too draconian, and perhaps there will be a wider confrontation between the government agencies and the judiciary at a later stage as well. My last question is to you is going to be about wider international implications, what's taking place in the United States. Many analysts say that something about our world, about our global order, has profoundly changed very recently. We don't know exactly in what way it has changed, but the change is in the making. And Trump is currently taking certain measures within the United States, which later could be transformed into a wider world. And some people are actually talking about the reform of the international legal order, even the reform of the United Nations. Recently, a proposition has been made that this Security Council structure, including 5 central members, the permanent members, could also be altered. With the argument being made is that today's Russia and China, they are of course successors to previous governments which were at the heart of the creation of the new legal order, but they have fundamentally changed. And if United States also acts in line with them, it will be 3-2, and something about UN system could change. Do you foresee something profoundly changing about the UN system, international legal order, as a result of what Trump doing today in the United States?
I'd say that the easy answer is clearly, but this is not new, and this is something that is important to highlight. I just wanted to go back very quickly to one thing that you said on the executive orders, which is just 2 very quick points. One of them is that some of those executive orders, they are really non-constitutional, especially the one on the birthrights and nationality, because this one is actually against the United States Constitution that is based on where people is born, which is what attributes them nationality. And on the other hand, what we're seeing with these executive orders is clearly an attempt to, bypass, in a sense, what is the normal legislative procedure, which is to go through Congress and go back to the Senate and come back to the Congress. So we have all of this system that is created to protect democracy, so presidents do not become autocrats. And what Donald Trump is doing is precisely trying to rule using executive orders, which means that he, even though he controls and has majority over the House and the Senate, he's trying to do this in a faster way, which doesn't go together with the other elected representatives, and including non-elected representatives that do not have any type of legitimacy or a way to be accounted for what they do, specifically talking about Elon Musk. On the question of the changing global order, this is not new. This is something that has been clearly talked about for a long time in scientific literature, especially with the rise of China as an economic power and with the fall of the Soviet Union, which is, in terms of historical times, something that happened yesterday. So when we look into the formation of this international world order in which we are living, the fall of the Soviet Union is still something very much recent. And we had this very small period of time during the 90s in which Russia was a little bit in a state of redefinition. But then when Vladimir Putin started to control the country, it came back to some ideals from the Soviet Union period. So it is still information. And the question of the reform of the United Nations is very old, actually, because the United Nations Security Council is the institution of the United Nations that has the ability to implement resolutions. So all of the other councils of the United Nations, they do not have the power of the Security Council to implement sanctions, to send troops. They are all, in terms of implementation, lower in stage than the other ones. And this question of reforming the Security Council is very old, because the Security Council only has 15 members. 5 of them, as you said, they're permanent members, so they're always there. And they have veto power. So many of the things that go against those 5 superpowers, which are the ones that won the Second World War, we're talking about Great Britain, the United States, France, China, and the Russian Federation, they're usually just vetoed. And this is something that impacts a lot how this kind of parliament of nations work. And on the other hand, the decline of the United Nations and the power of the United Nations is also something that is not really new. The question here is if the United Nations can still be reformed, and it has not been the intention of these 5 superpowers to reform the United Nations so far. This debate was very strong in the early 2000s, and up until today didn't happen. The question here is whether something else is going to emerge, maybe, just like we saw with the League of Nations, with a huge change in the world order. The League of Nations just ceased existing. And if the United States removes itself from key agencies in the United Nations and other countries follow, just like Israel's been doing, then we might be talking about the collapse of this kind of organizations. And at this moment, we are seeing a real retraction in terms of international politics, and not something that goes in favor of multilateralism. So at this moment, it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. But what we know is clearly that Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has a very complicated near future ahead. And it was, just to conclude, only 2 years ago when he spoke about this and said that multilateralism was under fire. So this is something that even the Secretary General has highlighted for a long time, and that is still yet for us to discover what is going to happen in the near future.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And my last question, I already said I've put to you my last question, but this one is going to be really the last one. Trump is always saying that now it's time for America First era. The impression given is that America, until this point, had been very altruistic, not thinking about its own national interests, and had been in a position of thinking about the entire world. Would it be fair to say that America, as any other reasonable, rational power, had always been acting within its best interest? It's just a question of different form of expansionism, because whatever we may say about USAID and other soft power tools, Trump's own way of looking at the world, own way of examining the world in terms of American penetration, may not include soft power tools, but include some other elements, including the harsh power, for example, the takeover or territorial elements. Would it be fair to say that American policy has always been based on America first, whatever one may think about Trump or other politicians? Would that be a fair assessment of the situation, would you say?
Absolutely. Clearly, the United States has been very much efficient in implementing both its hard power and soft power tools all over the world. And this is why we call everything that we've been seeing in terms of cultural expansion, in terms of aid, in terms of how the United States has been influencing other parts of the world, as imperialism. because precisely what's been going on is that we do not have traditional tools of colonialism in which countries occupy other lands and control them. But ever since the end of the Cold War, the United States has been defining the whole structure in which the United Nations agencies operate, for example, in terms of building peace and development, the types of institutions that are built. So mainly, for example, in 1992, when Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General of the United Nations, issued his agenda for peace, the main instruments for building peace that were designed there were liberal instruments based on the United States ideology, which is precisely the construction of liberal democracies with free markets that were able to enter the international market system. And by doing this, the United States gained markets, gained access to places to sell its product, to buy things, to develop its industry. And when we look into the war, for example, just to take a very important example of this, which is NATO. NATO is a good example on how the United States has actually profited a lot from the very issue of war, because NATO's got an interoperability clause which says that the member states need to have operational systems that can in a sense, be compatible to each other. So this means that you cannot get supplies from weapons from places which are not compatible. And in the end of the day, the main industry that is benefiting from the war in Ukraine, from the war in Israel and Gaza, is the United States arms industry. So obviously, this has always been America first. What is not clear to me is if Donald Trump doesn't understand this, or if he's trying to develop any type of different policy in the sense. What seems to me is that he's clearly isolating the country. And by isolating the country, he's going to see reactions. By increasing the tariff war, he's going to see, for example, the European Union giving back in terms of tariffs to the Prime Minister of Canada said the same. It's going to be dollar by dollar. So in the end of the day, if the United States is going to increase tariffs, those markets are going to look for alternatives, and the United States is going to lose it. So what we are seeing is clearly the demise of the United States, both in terms of economic power and also, obviously, soft power and its ability to influence the world.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Joanna Riccardo. Yeah, it looks like it has always been about America first, whether under Trump or under Democrats. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Most grateful to you. This was Joanna Riccardo, historian, political scientist, integrated researcher from Coimbra University, Portugal. See you very soon.